observing from the waiting room, thank you for your patience while we let the session before this end. I think a few more folks will come in as soon as the last session ends, but welcome and thank you for joining us for the third day of Connecticut's Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Chelsea Ross from the Partnership for Strong Communities, and Sean Gio is here as well from the partnership assisting me on this session. You can join the conversation at hashtag CAHC 2022 on Twitter and follow us at PSC Housing if you aren't already. This session is entitled Advancing Housing Justice in Connecticut by Reforming the Eviction System. And before we turn it over to our presenters today, just a couple of housekeeping. Thank you to our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, the Rosa Building Group, the Melville Charitable Trust, and Wells Fargo. Their deep support has allowed the conference to happen again this year. We also have a good slate of collaborating sponsors, which we'd like to thank, and an armful of supporting sponsors that have helped make this conference happen again. Their sponsorship allows us to keep it free for folks to attend, so we really appreciate that. Last but not least, thank you to Connecticut Voices for Children. They are the session sponsor for this session. And just a note that registration is open for our final I-Forum of the year, Tenant-Based Subsidies in Connecticut, Equitable Expansion. I'll drop a link to register for that I-Forum in the chat in just a second. It'll take place on Tuesday, December 6th from 10 to 12 p.m. and will feature an overview of tenant-based housing subsidy programs in Connecticut. And it'll be a great conversation, virtual, and I hope you all can join us. Just a few housekeeping issues or items rather. This session is being recorded, as all the sessions in the conference are. We will work to make the session recordings available as soon as possible on our YouTube channel. You've entered muted. Please stay on mute unless the speaker asks you to unmute. If you have a tech issue, you can select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send it to myself, Chelsea Ross, or Sean, and we will do our best to assist you, but no promises. And your speakers today will let you know how they would like content questions to be submitted. You should have that chat feature there. And post-session, you can complete a session feedback survey by clicking on the megaphone icon in the lobby. Excuse me, we really appreciate your feedback. And with that, I think I will turn it over to Eli.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. Great to see everyone here this afternoon. We're very excited for our panel, Advancing Housing Justice in Connecticut by Reforming the Eviction System, Lessons from the Pandemic. We've got a great panel here. I'm going to be moderating. I'm the legislative coordinator here at Connecticut Voices for Children, and I will let my fellow panelists introduce themselves, Samila, Dahlia, Giovanna, and Greta.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Samila Adilaye. I'm a research and policy fellow here at Connecticut Voices for Children.
Hi, Dahlia Romano. I am a staff attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center.
Hi, I'm Giovanna Shea, and I'm the Litigation and Advocacy Director at Greater Hartford Legal Aid, which is one of the Right to Counsel providers.
Hi, my name is Greta Blau. I'm a tenant organizer with Connecticut Tenant Union and the co-founder of the Saramonte Hamden Citywide Tenant Union.
So as you can see, we've got a great lineup of folks with both on-the-ground experience and folks who are doing the data research to dig into the details of the eviction crisis and how our housing system works in Connecticut. I'm going to lay out a little bit the agenda for our panel. First, we're going to start with some data and analysis from Samila and Dahlia. And then Greta and Giovanna are going to talk about what they were seeing in the housing crisis and the eviction system at the beginning of the pandemic. Then we're going to go back to Samila to talk about some of the policies that the state of Connecticut and the federal government implemented during the pandemic, which had a huge impact on our housing system. And then we're going to go back to Greta and Giovanna to talk about the impact those policies had and what they saw in their work and in their day-to-day lives from those policies. Then Dahlia has a presentation to share about a resource that her organization put together to help folks through the eviction process. And then lastly, I'm going to share some details about which legislative priorities we see as being on the table in the upcoming legislative session. Then we'll do some Q&A, and throughout, I'd encourage folks to please put any questions in the chat, and we will come back to them at the end for the Q&A. With that, I will turn it over to Dahlia.
Thanks so much, Eli. Let's see if I can successfully share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that all right?
That looks great.
So I'm just going to talk fairly briefly about a report that the Connecticut Fair Housing Center released in conjunction with the Connecticut Data Collaborative and with funding by the Aurora Women and Girls Foundation. We released this this past spring. And this is sort of a very short version of a longer presentation. So I would really encourage you to check out the full report, which is at this link here. I'm also happy to answer any questions if there's something that I don't address. What this report looks at is all eviction filings between 2017 and 2021. So when we say looking at filings, we're looking at the beginning of an eviction case. We didn't look specifically at outcomes just because that data is a lot harder to analyze. And so we focused on the filings, but even just the act of having a case filed against you as a tenant can have long-term effects. So tenants often have trouble finding future housing if they have a record of an eviction filing against them, regardless of the outcome. So we do think that this data is still very valuable in giving us a sense of the eviction crisis in the state. All right, so first, just looking at the breakdown of who is being evicted and who is most disproportionately affected by eviction in the state, we found that Black renters over all years were 3 times more likely to face eviction than white renters, and that Hispanic or Latinx renters were 2 times more likely. Then looking at gender, we found that female-headed households, so that's what we mean when we say female renters, were 56% of eviction cases, so the majority of eviction cases. And then when we look at sort of the intersection of race and gender, Black female-headed households were the most likely of any population to face evictions. They made up for 62% of eviction filings, and then Hispanic Latina female-headed households made up 59%. Okay. And then this is sort of going to frame what others will be talking about later, the importance of the Right to Counsel program. When we looked at filings between 2017 and 2021, and so this has probably changed somewhat now that the Right to Counsel program has started to be implemented. But during that time period, 80% of landlords had access to an attorney in an eviction case, whereas only 7% of renters had access to legal counsel. We found, again, pretty sharp disparities based on race and gender. White renters, 37% more likely than Black renters to have an attorney, 30% more likely than Hispanic or Latina renters to have an attorney, and then male renters were 7% more likely than female renters to have representation when facing eviction. And we know that this makes a huge difference in the outcomes of eviction cases. In 2019, unrepresented tenants were almost twice as likely to have removal orders. So that is looking at the end of the case, and that's the removal order is what allows a marshal to force a tenant to move out of their home. They're twice as likely to have that issued against them if they do not have access to legal counsel. And then just quickly, so we did look, and this is going to go into the data that Samaila is going to talk about. You can see that from 2017 until like the beginning of 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic started, eviction filings across the state were fairly steady, the numbers per year, and then dropped significantly when certain protections went into effect at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then the number of filings just started to steadily increase as those protections were lifted. And you will see a graph later, I don't believe it's here, no. that shows that now in 2022, the eviction filings are back to pre-pandemic levels. So I'll pass this along. I know we have a lot of ground to cover and a short amount of time, but I would really encourage you to check out the data report. It's very interesting. You can also access this map here and get up-to-date information on numbers of filings based on zip code, literally up to today. So that's how I was able to make some of the graphs that you'll see. And Samaila, I will pass it to you and hopefully successfully give you control. Okay. Oh, Samaila, you're muted.
Good afternoon, thanks. And we're deeply grateful for the opportunity to discuss some of our findings from the research from our eviction project that we will be publishing soon. So I'll be sharing a few of our findings. And first, I'm going to discuss two big areas in our work. I'll discuss the outcomes of evictions, what the outcomes might have on families and children. And then I will talk about how evictions are closely linked to the issues of housing affordability and income. And so we know very well that the threat of evictions could drastically change family life, and we can logically surmise that the trauma associated with evictions is one that negatively impacts children. Interestingly, research has shown that having children may be linked to a higher risk of facing evictions. And so we considered this by looking at the child population in Connecticut towns and found that across the state, using data from 2017 to 2021, more children meant a higher eviction filing rate. And so to the side in red, we have the number of eviction filings per 100 rental units, and that's our eviction filing rate. And on the horizontal axis, you can see the number of children or the population of people under the age of 18 in a given town. And based on our estimates, if a town has 5,000 children, the eviction filing rate is estimated to be 2.6. However, if it has about 30,000 children, the eviction filing rate is 4.3. We also were interested in seeing the impact it had on family life and how it could affect families and children. And so in comparing, say, a town that had an eviction filing rate of 5 eviction filings per 100 rental units and one that had an eviction filing rate of, say, maybe 10, we estimate that this difference, so comparing a town that has an eviction filing rate of 5 and one that has an eviction filing rate of 15, this difference of 10 is linked to a 112% change in the rate of violent family incidents, 180% change in the rates of child neglect, and 87.5% change in the rate of juvenile arrest. And for schools in these towns, 114.3% change in the share of students who are chronically absent. And so eviction filing is kind of linked to an increase in all these issues. So evictions are strongly tied to an inability to afford housing costs. And our analysis of evictions in towns across the state show that communities where households struggle to afford housing costs in Connecticut are also the ones that are most likely to face the threat of evictions. I think researchers estimate that about 90% of eviction cases have something to do with affordability or non-payment of rent. So we kind of tested this first by looking at the median household income across towns in in Connecticut. And again, to the side in red, we have the eviction filing rate. And then in blue, that shows the median household income per town. And we estimate that wealthier towns, or towns that has wealthier residents, have lower eviction filing rates. So if a town has a median household income of, say, $150,000, the eviction filing rate is estimated to about 1.7. But if a town has a median household income of, say, $50,000, the rate will be 3.3. So that's almost double, by the way. And then even simply by observing without any analysis data from just 1 year in 2019, you can see that the higher the percentage of households in a community paying 30% or more of their income on housing, the higher the eviction filing rates. And so the blue dots kind of represent the different towns in Connecticut. And to the side in red, we have the eviction filing rate, and in blue, the share or the percentage of households in that town who are cost burdened, meaning they pay 30% or more of their income for housing cost. And you can see the trend line is showing that the more people are unable, the share of people who are unable to who are paying a large portion of their income on housing cost, the higher the eviction filing rate. And so I'll stop there, but I want to reiterate that by looking at the eviction filings, like something that Dalia touched on as well, we're only looking at cases that made it to the court system. And so many households are evicted informally yearly with no trace of these events in court records. And so we don't have a way to like measure those who are informally evicted.
Thank you, Dalia and Smile. And I think that was a really important last point. Smile, I appreciate you for mentioning that. So now we want to turn to Giovanna and Greta to sort of take us back in time a little bit to the early days of the pandemic and maybe before the pandemic, to talk about what you were seeing and hearing from the tenants that you work with, friends and family as well, about the housing instability situation and the eviction crisis at that moment. So maybe Giovanna, you could start.
Sure. I think it's really important to note and emphasize what Dalia's data showed, which was that Connecticut already was in an eviction crisis prior to the pandemic. So some of our cities, Hartford, Bridgeport, Waterbury, had among the highest eviction rates in the nation. In 2018, Hartford's eviction rate was actually twice the national average. In the city of Hartford, there were more than 5 eviction judgments being entered per day, and we were second to Waterbury. They had more, a higher rate. So during the pandemic, we layered on top of that existing housing and eviction crisis, skyrocketing and sudden unemployment for folks who may not previously have experienced housing instability. People may remember there were federal unemployment insurance benefits. Getting those benefits to folks who needed them relied on legacy computer systems. Overnight, there were many people who were trying to claim their unemployment insurance benefits. New systems had to be created to get money out the door. And ultimately, by May of 2020, 22% of Connecticut renters had missed a rental payment. And about that same percentage, about 140,000 people in Connecticut feared they could not make rent for May 2022. And Jacqueline Rabe Thomas of the CT Mirror reported that 3/4 of those were people of color. So all of this was occurring in the context of a public health emergency, in which doubling up and congregate shelters, which are some of our usual emergency offerings, carried even greater risks than usual. So that's where we stood when the pandemic started. And Greta, maybe you can tell us more about the tenants you're working with.
Sure. Hi. So before the pandemic, I can only speak about my complex, but it's a very, it's a good on the ground view of what Giovanna was just talking about. So before the pandemic, as far as where I live, on the 11th, they would start sending out notices to quit. So if you didn't pay your rent by the 10th, 11th, you're getting a notice to quit, and they would send an email out. So they were using this a lot as a strategy to get people to pay their rent, as a strategy to get people out. It was all just part of everyday business. I got more into watching what was happening with evictions when the pandemic started. At the beginning, the landlords were still serving notices to quit steadily to a lot of tenants. Even after the moratorium, the landlord that we have is the highest evictor in the state, with thousands of units and thousands of evictions. And that didn't stop because of a moratorium. They usually, keep going until they're told to stop. As Dahlia said, we did see that these were mostly affecting Black and Latinx mothers and children. And on top of that, people who lost their jobs, which could be the same mother, and elderly and disabled is what we're seeing at that point.
Thanks, Giovanna and Greta. So as you can see in this graph that's up here, there was a dramatic drop in evictions in the middle of 2020. And we're going to turn it over to Samaila to talk a little bit about some of the policies that Giovanna and Greta just mentioned, and that led to that huge drop off.
There were several pandemic-era programs and policies introduced in 2020 and 2021 that reduced the number of eviction filings and protected many renter households from the threat of evictions. And these pandemic-era programs and policies included the eviction moratoria, which Greta just spoke about, and these place prohibitions on landlords and their ability to file evictions against certain tenants. So these include the CAHC Act moratorium, the Connecticut's own eviction moratorium, and the CDC eviction moratoria. Also, Congress approved about $46 billion in emergency rental assistance through the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 and the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. And this is administered across the state through Unite City. And Unite City sort of provided up to $15,000 in rental and electricity payments for Connecticut households that were financially impacted by the COVID pandemic. And then we also had City Executive Order 12D here in Connecticut that sort of changed the rules on when landlords could file for evictions, particularly giving up to 30 days before tenants, 30 days notice before evictions could be filed against the tenant, and also ensuring that an application was made for rental assistance before an eviction could be filed against the tenants. I just want to mention that what this did as well was that if a case was already in the courts for eviction and there was a rental application with Unite City that was being processed, it had to wait until the decision was made before it could progress. So we also had economic interventions that may have indirectly impacted eviction filings. We had the American Rescue Plan, which included the expanded child tax credit, the Coronavirus Aid Relief and Economic Securities Act signed into law in March, expanded states' ability to provide unemployment insurance for many workers who would have been covered under the usual unemployment benefits. We also had like 3 stimulus check payments. And these kind of provided cash to families, giving them increased access to funds that could have potentially offset housing cost or the rent burden for them, and might have helped them to avoid evictions. And so I'll just go back to this to Dahlia's slide showing the trend.
Thank you, Smilah. So now I'll turn back to Greta and Giovanna to talk about the impact that some of these policies had, and particularly, which you saw being the most impactful. What lessons you've taken away from the fact that, as we can see, when we really wanted to, as a state and federal government and our local communities, we were able to keep people in their homes. So maybe Greta, you can go first.
So there was an extremely positive impact from some of these programs. As soon as the Unite CT funds were available and known about, which took a little bit, people started applying for it. And I saw dozens of renters, probably 80% were saved through the Unite CT program. The Executive Order 12D was the one that really helped the Unite CT, because it required landlords to apply to Unite CT before the landlord could deliver a notice to quit for non-payment. So they were required to do that. And we also found that this helped tenants because many of them received funds and avoided eviction, displacement from school, and homelessness. The stay portion of the order helped because there would be a freeze of a case until the funds are received. And this is important because children were remaining in their schools and in their neighborhoods where their friends were. It also was helpful that this documentation was in Spanish, as many people who are in this position do not speak English proficiently. As far as the evictions being avoided because of expanded tax credits and unemployment benefits, I would imagine many people avoided eviction due to those funds.
Yeah, thank you, Greta. Of course, the programs weren't perfect, but I agree there were two things that happened that were critical. One was slowing down the pace of evictions, and the other was providing a rental assistance. So I think those would be, two kind of big takeaways. There were, as was discussed, there were multiple overlapping sort of federal and state programs during this whole time period, right? Beginning with initial moratoria on evictions with just a few exceptions, like for serious nuisance, and then more exceptions, something that was called at the time serious non-payment of rent under the governor's executive orders. That was more than a 6-month arrearage. There was the federal CARES Act moratorium, which applied to either properties with federal mortgages or those that were federally subsidized or financed. And a big part of that was a requirement of a 30-day notice to quit, which actually is still an extant requirement for folks who are facing eviction if they live in federally subsidized housing or their landlord has a federally backed mortgage backed by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. They are entitled to 30 days on a notice to quit, and that requirement has not been repealed. That was a huge change because in Connecticut, typically it's 3 days to the quit date from, that's required when you get the notice to quit. So from 3 days to 30, that was a really big change. There was also the Centers for Disease Control declarations that folks could file at one point. That was another method of slowing down evictions. And then, as Greta and Smilah have said, in Connecticut, we had Executive Order 12D, which when some of the moratoria expired, landlords were required in non-payment cases to apply to the Unite CT program to give out information about Unite CT with their notice to quit. And there was a 30-day stay that was available. So sometimes that actually wasn't long enough. and attorneys had to go back into court and ask for more time, but there was a 30-day stay. So that did really help to slow down a process that can often, in the absence of those protections, just move like a freight train with a 3-day pleading schedule, candidly. So assistance for tenants, slowing down the eviction process. Those were, really the two big takeaways. Now, the Unite CT landlord-tenant participation agreement required landlords to withdraw an eviction if they got funds, and forbade them from, initiating any kind of eviction process for any month in which they received assistance, or in any month in which they received assistance. Predictably, we had some litigation about that on the back end in many cases. Sadly, I'm seeing that, we see many tenants whose evictions were withdrawn, who still are having difficulty getting housing because the record of that filing remains on their record, and that's hurting them with new landlords. So that is something that remains with us from this pandemic time, even though many of these programs did avert, absolute catastrophe.
Greta, did you want to add something?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add like a few things that I learned from it. I learned that many people's housing is extremely precarious. And these programs are needed, and we need more of these programs. That people without resources are targeted. And I'm glad that we live in Connecticut, because we had a lot of things here that other states did not have. And housing is a human right. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I also wanted to just emphasize that I think that the data that we're seeing right here and what Giovanna and Greta just shared really emphasizes that the status quo is not how things have to be. We can keep families in their homes when we make a commitment to do that. And as we saw during the pandemic, programs that provide support and resources for low and middle income families, provide rental assistance, particularly at critical moments, and policies that emphasize patience and understanding as people are navigating their housing situations. And when we make stopping eviction a top priority, we can do that and change the status quo. So now I wanted to, first I wanted to just remind folks that if you have any questions, feel free to please just drop them in the chat and we'll come to them later. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Dahlia. One additional lesson that we've learned during the pandemic, that we've known all along, is that the eviction process is very complicated, and Dahlia and the Connecticut Fair Housing Center have put together a resource to help folks navigate it. So Dahlia, if you want to share.
Thank you. Yes, let's see if I can. I might have to stop the share and then. Okay. There we go. Okay. So yeah, I am here partially to share a new resource that the Connecticut Fair Housing Center just published. We have been working for a few years actually on writing a guide for tenants facing eviction, because as I discussed earlier, we know that tenants who don't have representation from a lawyer are significantly more likely to be forced from their homes. And we also know that unfortunately in Connecticut right now, we don't have the resources to provide every tenant with a lawyer. Although my hope is that as the Right to Counsel program becomes more robust and is fully implemented, that will be less of an issue. But in the meantime, we saw a need for a resource for tenants facing eviction without a lawyer that would hopefully help people to navigate the really complicated and overwhelming court process, and make it a little bit easier to understand. So this is sort of the landing page, and I can also drop the link into the chat if it hasn't been dropped. It has. Thank you, Chelsea. Perfect. And what this guide does, it has a few different functions. It can be used as kind of like something that you read through. So for example, if a tenant received a notice to quit, could just go to this section and read about what a notice to quit is, what requirements there are to respond once you get a notice to quit, what kinds of resources might be available to you as a tenant going in to face, you know, the start of an eviction case. And then we also have this built-in form filler for tenants who have an active case against them. And I'm not going to go into the form filler because that would require me to put in the docket number of a tenant facing eviction, and I don't want to share someone's personal information. But if somebody has a court case started against them, they will have what's called a docket number. You can look that up on the judicial website and get your docket number if you don't know what it is. And okay, and once you put that in, it will pull your name and contact information from the case and then help you fill out any forms that you need to fill out, which you can then print and submit to the court. So it's kind of the website has a couple of different functions. It can be a way to just learn generally about the process. It can also be a tool that a tenant can use to respond to eviction papers. And I will say that I have used the form filler as well as an advocate. I find it to be a useful tool in helping someone else to fill out forms. And we are hoping that this guide, in addition to being a resource for tenants, is also something that advocates, organizers, community members, people who are working with tenants who might be facing eviction can use to become more familiar with the eviction process and to sort of help people navigate that. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton more to share other than encouraging everyone to please check out this site, use this resource, direct people to it. And I am happy to do a more in-depth demo to anybody. If you work for an organization that would find that helpful, please feel free to reach out. I'll drop my email in the chat, and I can sort of, do something a little more in depth than what I've done today. But yeah, any questions about that? I'm putting my email in the chat right now. All right. I will stop sharing, but please share widely. We're trying to make sure that people know that this is a resource that exists and are able to use it. And if you find any technological glitches or anything, because we did just release this website and build it from scratch, please also reach out to me, and we can try to address anything that comes up.
I think we had one question about the website, which was about translation and language availability.
Oh, sure. Thank you for asking. I meant to address that. It is currently just in English, but we are in the process of getting it translated into Spanish. Hopefully that will be done in the next couple of months. And then we are aiming to get it probably translated into third or even fourth language.
Perfect. Can everyone see my screen? So now we wanted to turn quickly to some of the legislation that we know is going to be or expect to be on the table during the upcoming legislative session. And a lot of it is related to some of the issues that we've discussed today, some of the policies that were maybe implemented during the pandemic, discussed during the pandemic, and obviously policies that have been advocated for a long time, and some that you have probably heard discussed during this conference over the last couple of days. So first, I'm going to talk about policies related to zoning and housing affordability and housing supply. The Open Communities Alliance will be advocating for their fair share and urban revitalization framework, which is about making sure that towns across the state are building enough affordable housing to meet the need in Connecticut. Desegregate Connecticut will likely be advocating for their work, live, ride, and transit-oriented communities proposal, which is focused on building more housing and including deeply affordable housing, particularly near transit stations. We expect that the public housing authorities around the state will be continuing to advocate for legislation to allow them to expand their jurisdiction and build public housing outside of the towns that they're specifically located in. We also know that there's definitely going to be continued advocacy around expanding rental assistance, especially, we know how impactful that in particular was during the pandemic. We are also expect that there will be efforts to protect 830G against advocacy to reduce its impact on building more affordable housing around the state. And we also expect that there'll be work to establish a right to housing in state statute. And then on tenant protections, again, a lot of these ideas are things that have been worked on in the past, or that we learned about their importance during the pandemic. So one is good or just cause eviction, which makes it much more difficult for landlords to evict tenants. Rent control in some form, and trying to limit the very large rent increases that can obviously make housing very unstable for folks. Expansion of protections for tenants with a criminal record or an eviction record. As Giovanna shared earlier, this has become a huge problem, I think, especially as the housing market in the state is incredibly tight. Landlords are using these these markers as a way to exclude tenants from the pool of applicants. There are also going to be efforts to make it easier for tenants to open family and group childcare centers in their homes, which is legislation that's been worked on for a while. And there will also be continued advocacy around the right to counsel program, which was established last year and is already making a huge impact to provide legal counsel for folks who are facing eviction. We also expect some new legislation around raising the fines that can be that municipalities can levy on landlords that violate the housing code. Those fines are currently just $250, which hasn't been changed since 2003. So there will be efforts to change that. There are also will be efforts to require that landlords put on file with municipalities a natural person or a real person's name, which would be someone who could be contacted if there are maintenance issues or an emergency. This is something that we confront all the time, where lots of landlords have sort of layers of LLCs that make it very difficult to for officials and advocates to identify who actually is in charge and is responsible for these properties. And then, as always, we are going to be working to expand to protect existing tenant protections and make sure we're not going backward. So now we'll turn to questions, and I also am going to drop a very short survey in the chat, just as a sort of post panel follow-up, which gives folks an opportunity to share which of the policies that we talked about seem most impactful, which you might be interested in working with Connecticut Voice for Children, with Connecticut for Housing Center, Greater Hartford Legal Aid, and tenant union movement to organize around in the upcoming legislative session. So we'd be very grateful if you'd be willing to fill it out. It'll just take a minute or two. And now we have a couple of questions from earlier, and feel free to drop more in the chat as we go through. The first is from Representative Winkler. He asks, when will the right to counsel program be expanded to the majority of towns? And Dahlia, maybe you want to talk about that?
I wonder if Giovanna might be the best person since they
Sure.
are a right to counsel provider.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone on this call can really say that definitively. So we've started out with rolling out the right to counsel program in 14 zip codes here in Connecticut. Right now in Hartford, we're providing assistance to clients in 06105 and 06120 zip codes. We've expanded our housing unit from 2.8 attorneys to now some 9 or 10 attorneys who are doing right to counsel. GHLA alone has, since the program started January 31st, has helped over 400 tenants. But I think it's also important to recognize that there's tremendous work to do to bring right to counsel to more communities. And we're in the middle of the picture right now is that eviction filings have rebounded way past, past pre-pandemic rates. And in fact, 211 United Way is reporting that it has had to reduce other services because they are inundated by calls from tenants facing imminent homelessness. They're getting 176% of the calls they got in 2017. So sadly, we were able to hold off the eviction crisis with these protections and policies for a time. But right now we are seeing a renewed eviction crisis, and we are seeing tenants paying for hotel rooms, doubling up, sleeping in their cars. We are seeing seniors on fixed incomes, which I think was the focus of a previous panel, just in a really, really tight spot. And right to counsel is a very important part of a whole portfolio of protections and reforms that are necessary to protect tenants here in Connecticut. Eviction records, as Eli said, really are keeping people, even just records of filings, not even that you lost an eviction, no matter the cause, they are keeping people from finding homes. And right now, with the vacancy rate as low as it is, we are seeing even tenants who have Section 8 vouchers unable to find an affordable and safe unit, often even with the assistance of case managers. So we have, due to a lot of economic conditions, very tight vacancy rate, very high eviction filing rate, horrible repercussions to even records of eviction filings, which, currently are staying on the judicial website, even if the case was dismissed or withdrawn for 1 year. And folks, commercial subscribers can subscribe to judicial branch data and are relying even on dismissals, even on withdrawals to deny folks housing. So when will right to counsel roll out to more towns and communities? We hope soon. One question is also having enough attorneys. So we hope soon. We are working really hard here at GHLA, and the outlook for our clients right now is more difficult than it's been in a long time.
Thanks, Giovanna. And I'll just add, I think that in a lot of ways, this is going to come down to funding and whether the state makes a commitment to make the right to counsel program permanent and provides funding after federal money runs out. And it obviously takes a little bit of time for an expansive program like right to counsel to roll out. So we need to make sure that it's not just a short-term stopgap for a couple of years. It's a long-term commitment that the state is making. So we also have a question asking, is there a movement at the state level to extend the current 3-day notice to quit generally, or ban the use of notice to quit to deny applicants? What else is being pursued at the state level or potentially local level to build in more protections?
So what we have proposed at GHLA is a reform that is a version of what we brought to the legislature last year with the support of other public interest lawyering organizations in Connecticut, which is to reduce the time that dismissals, withdrawals, and tenant victories remain on the website so that they are removed as soon as possible and no later than 30 days. And also to reduce the amount of time that judgments for landlords candidly remain on the judicial branch website from 3 years to 2 years. And also to require that the judicial branch data to which commercial purchasers can subscribe, that it has to be the most recent version of what is publicly available on the judicial branch website, so that they aren't purchasing an older version that includes dismissals and withdrawals and lots of other material. So we hope that is one protection that can keep people from being denied housing. Of course, as I forget who said it, maybe Dahlia said it or Samila, notices to quit are not filed in court. So that moment of the filing of a complaint, that is an important moment because that is the record of a filing, you know, in the digital universe. And that can be very frustrating for tenants because no judge has yet said that you did anything wrong.
Thank you. Thank you, Giovanna. We have another question asking, how do you see your advocacy for rent control interacting or overlapping with affordable housing plans and fair rent commission requirements?
I can speak to that. The Fair Housing Center has been doing a lot of advocacy in conjunction with other organizations around fair rent. And the way that we see it is fair rent commissions are a very useful tool. We did just pass legislation statewide this past session requiring certain towns with populations over 25,000 to establish fair rent commissions. But they're kind of a case-by-case solution. So each time a tenant gets an unreasonable rent increase, they have to file with their town's commission. And then the commission has to review it, whereas a more sweeping statewide rent control program would cover all tenants. And so it wouldn't require that sort of constant individual case-by-case review. And there is also the issue of not all towns in Connecticut are required to have fair rent commissions. So very frequently I'm getting calls from folks who live in towns without fair rent commissions. And unless they have a population that means that they would be required to establish one, there's really not very much that they can do. And so there's this real stark difference in what different tenants, depending where they live, depending on what kinds of resources they have in their town, are able to do to push back against rent increases.
Thanks, Dahlia. And I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, but I wanted to ask Greta to share a little bit more about the tenant organizing work that she's been doing, because I think the tenant movement that we've seen growing in the state over the last few years is incredibly exciting and is having a big impact both on the ground for the tenants in their housing complexes, but also at the statewide level in strengthening the advocacy movement. So Greta, I wanted to let you share a little bit more about how you got involved in tenant organizing and what that work has been like, what challenges you faced.
I got involved because I'm a tenant in a complex that is owned by slumlords who live out of state. And we're finding that that's a pattern, is that people are coming from out of state, they're buying up places, and they are flipping them after a few years just to make money on the land. As far as, yeah, so my husband and I, you know, we were being attacked. The landlords were using predatory towing on us. They took our car, they took a lot of people's cars. It was an attack on us. And the challenges that we've had as far as getting tenants to be interested in this movement is there's a great sense of hopelessness among people in places like this. People do not believe that anything is going to happen. People are afraid. They're afraid of retaliation. They're afraid of someone calling DCF. There's a lot of things that people are afraid of in places like this that people who don't live in places like this don't know and don't understand. And the impact that we've had is amazing. There's so much going on right now. It's mind-blowing. We have more to do than we can handle. It's growing so fast in Hamden. The movement is growing so fast in Connecticut, in the country, in the world. And we've gotten the commission in Hamden back up and running and functioning for tenants, which is an amazing, amazing thing to watch, because the first couple were a mess, but it's totally up and running, it's functioning, and that's just wonderful to see. And that's all through tenant organizing. And we're working on getting a tenant rights ordinance through in the town very soon, a strong tenants right ordinance that will protect tenants more. We have more work to do in the state. We can't do anything if we don't pass good cause eviction. If we go to the Fair Rent Commission and we get someone's rent lowered for a year, guess what happens at the end of that year? They get evicted. They don't get another lease. So that for me is like the big hole in the process that we have right now. If we had that protection, a lot more people would be able to stay where they're living. A lot more people would be able to know where they're going to be living for the next couple of years. They wouldn't have to worry every single year, where am I going to live? Where are my kids going to go to school? So that's pretty much, like what my experience has been in the last 1 minute of the program. So I didn't want to go on too long. But.
Thanks so much, Greta. That was powerful. And we appreciate you being here. And we are grateful to everyone for following along over the past hour, and grateful to Samila, Giovanna, and Dahlia, and Greta for sharing their knowledge and experience. I will drop, again, the link to this very quick poll that we put together, which is an opportunity for folks to connect with us about the advocacy work we're doing and share which policies you might be interested in working on, as well as our contact information if folks on the panel want to drop that in the chat as well. And I'm sure we'll see you in the work soon.
Thank you for a great presentation. And our next session, as I dropped in the chat, is at 1:30, which is right now, the legislative panel. So please head over there if you would like to join. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.